Hi everyone, welcome to another event from the Oxford Economic Society. I'm Guan, the president of our society. Due to COVID restrictions, all our events this term will be online, here on Facebook and uploaded to YouTube afterwards if you missed the live broadcast. Last Thursday, we had Professor Damodaran talking to us about the impacts of COVID-19 on financial markets. Today, we have Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, a reader in the Political Economy of Development at the University of Cambridge, who will be talking to us about the consequences of COVID-19 on the economy, also touching on some developing economies. We'll be having a 45-minute presentation followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. If you would like to submit questions for Dr. Chang, do use the Pigeonhole link posted on the event page and the comments section of this video. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Chang, and feel free to share your screen when you're ready.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be back in the Oxford Economic Society, although only online this time. I was physically there the last autumn, giving another talk, and how much the world has changed. I mean, we are literally living through the biggest socio-economic crisis that the world has experienced since the Great Depression. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, back in April predicted that the world GDP will fall by 3%. And then in June, it moved the prediction downward to 5% contraction. In October, it has slightly upgraded the prediction to a 4.4% contraction, but that was really before the European countries started imposing second lockdowns with the disease spiraling out of control. So I think that 4.4% contraction is looking rather optimistic. You know, in 2008, with the global financial crisis, the world economy contracted only by 1%. So 5% contraction is huge. And with this contraction, a lot of countries have tried to keep businesses afloat with subsidies and loans, have tried to keep people in employment by paying employment subsidies to companies. But despite this, unemployment is rising. And in countries with less intervention, like the US, unemployment at its height reached a level that was never seen since the Great Depression. On some count, the rate of unemployment in the US was at over 20% back in May and June. And that's the level that you saw the last time during the Great Depression. Fortunately, people have not suffered despite this unemployment as much as during the Great Depression, largely because of the experiences of the Great Depression. Many rich countries have now a strong welfare state. I mean, that didn't exist during before the Great Depression. Well, I mean, it existed only very, very minimally. So for example, in the late 19th century, the entire social spending of the European countries was as a proportion of GDP between 0 and 1%. You know? Today, the OECD average is about 21%. Some countries spend over 30% of GDP on the social spending. And even in that, relatively poor economies like Mexico, you are still spending 6-7% of GDP on social spending. So compared to the days before the Great Depression, the welfare state has expanded a lot, and that has meant that even if people are unemployed, they had some income support. And in countries with a weaker welfare state, like the US or the South Korea, the government has actually paid out the income subsidies, the so-called helicopter money, or disaster-related basic income or whatever you call it. The government would send a check to supplement people's income, because in those countries, welfare state is much weaker than in the European countries, and the government couldn't just sit and watch people descending into poverty and starvation. But as time goes by, many governments are slowly reducing these subsidies. There's a great tension about this, because there are a lot of people who are worried, although much more than they should be, about the soaring budget deficit. My view is that you have to treat the current situation like a major war. If during the Second World War, the countries like the US and Britain said, well, we should stop fighting Hitler because we are worried about budget deficit, that would have meant the end of the society as they knew it. So they first concentrated on winning the war and worried about the budget deficit later. And yeah, by generating the good economic growth after the war, they were able to manage it without any major problems. So anyway, but that's something that we might talk about a bit later. So, unemployment is slowly rising, that with the cuts in the income subsidies, that people are suffering more and more. So that we are in a very, very difficult situation. And then because many countries have failed to contain the disease, they have to keep locking down the economy, which is making things extremely difficult and politically volatile. Well, the important thing about this crisis is that it's not simply a crisis, that standard crisis in which output is reduced, unemployment rises, but then after a while it recovers. I mean, we will recover one day, but this is a crisis that is much more serious than normal economic crisis, in the sense that this crisis is forcing us to change the way we run the economy and broader society. And more importantly, it's a crisis that is forcing us to ask some serious questions about the values and priorities that we have had taken for granted about our society and economy. So let me talk about this in the rest of the talk. Now, of course, at this point, it is impossible to predict how things are going to change. I mean, we know that it's going to change, the crisis is going to change a lot of things, but we don't know how soon and in what manner the disease is going to be brought under control. So, for example, if the disease is brought under control in the next year, maybe two, a lot of things will go back to the old ways. But if it takes longer, then a lot of things will change. And this is not, the unpredictability of how the disease is going to be brought under control is not only about kind of medical advances. Are we going to get the reliable vaccine next spring or 2 years later? I mean, that's critical, but that's not the only thing that makes this prediction difficult. What makes this prediction difficult is that what changes happen will also depend on how people, as individuals, as groups, as nations, and as even the entire humanity change their values and organize themselves. So the big social changes do not happen automatically. They always involve human agency. So how actual people, whether it's individuals or groups or nations, organize themselves, and what exactly they change in what way will determine the exact the outcome of this. And that since these sorry, things like the people changing their values or organizing themselves into new groups, and creating, I don't know, new political parties, new forms of financing. I mean, all of these are inherently unpredictable because people have free will, people have the ethical values, and people have imagination. But having said that, we can make some predictions, and I think that it's more in the spirit of thinking about these possible changes together, rather than making, I mean, sorry, behaving like a prophet, saying these are likely to happen, those are likely to happen. That I'm going to present this to you today. So I think yeah, let me share this one slide. I'm not going to do a slideshow, but there's one slide that I want to share with you all. So today I'm going to talk about two types of changes that this the crisis will bring about. Yeah? So on the left-hand column, you have highly likely and predictable, well, not entirely, but relatively predictable changes. And under this, we have these four categories. And on the right-hand side column, we have likely but difficult to predict changes. And then under those, I have also four categories. I mean, show this now for a while and then switch back to the screen, because it's no fun watching the same PowerPoint for 40 minutes. I mean, not that I'm much fun to look at, but at least I'm better than one single slide because I move. Anyway, so of the highly likely and predictable changes, the first is long-term scars of the economic crisis. And it is well known that when you have a major economic crisis, there's what economists call hysteresis effect. So output goes down, employment falls. Even if the general condition improves, it doesn't bounce back at exactly to exactly where it was. There's a dampening effect. Now, for example, if the one enterprise collapses in normal time, that doesn't leave that kind of effect, because the assets and the workers that were employed by this the company can get relatively quickly redeployed. So the company goes bankrupt. Okay, I mean, some of the machines might go to scrap it, but a lot of them will be bought as second-hand machines. Workers will find another job. But when you have this major crisis, you will find it extremely difficult to redeploy the assets and workers, because everyone is in a bad position. No one's in a position to build new enterprises. So this will lead to scrapping of a lot of assets that could have been used as second-hand machines. They'll have to be scrapped because no one wants to buy them. Workers will experience decay in skills, because it's not just a few weeks that they are unemployed, but a few months, 6 months, maybe a year or two. And during that period, their skills will decay. And because enterprises are disbanded, a lot of productive knowledge embodied in enterprises will disappear, because especially if you have studied management theories, you will know that enterprises a lot of knowledge is embodied in the enterprise itself rather than people who work for it, because of course people who work for the enterprise have skills, they have experiences, they have intelligence, but organizations have their own organizational structure, organizational routine, institutional memory, archives, you name it. So when the enterprise disappears, even if everyone who used to work there gets a job somewhere else, a lot of knowledge that used to be contained in the enterprise will disappear. And also at the individual level, people who experience long-term unemployment and as a result, the reduction in their income have their productive potentials reduced because they have to run debt, which give them a lot of physical and mental stress. Some younger people might have to have their education interrupted because their parents cannot support them anymore. So they will be decay at the sort of level of individual human capital, but also you have to realize that there will be decay in collective capabilities. Okay, the second, the more predictable consequence of this crisis is changes in the production methods. I mean, we are already on a daily basis experiencing it. Shops sell in different ways. I mean, things like the restaurants have to provide the service in a different way. Education is already different. We are doing a lot of stuff online. So we are seeing huge changes in the method of providing face-to-face services. Also, we are seeing a lot of increase in the proportion of office workers working from home. Labor-intensive industries like garment making or food processing will have to change the production method. In the US, in Germany, meat processing the factories were important sources of disease transmission because in those factories, we are literally on top of each other, kind of chopping up and kind of classifying the animal parts and so on. So, those labor-intensive industries will have to adjust the way they produce things. Of course, some of these changes will quickly revert to the old ways once the pandemic is brought under control. I mean, restaurants wouldn't keep the shields between tables anymore. I mean, shops that will not, say only 6 people can be in the shop at the same time. However, there are changes that will stick. For example, especially office work. Many workers and companies actually say they want to maintain a high degree of home working even after the pandemic because they realize that this makes the workers more efficient. They are not exhausted by the commute. They also the company that can reduce a lot of real estate costs, because they are not keeping expensive offices in expensive areas. Of course, there are benefits of being in the office, working together, and so on. So I don't think that office work will be completely displaced, but I think the way we use offices will become very different. So the second point was that change in the method of production, and then the third is changes in the consumption structure. We are already seeing big changes in the pattern of demand. I mean, of course, that it all depends on the particular sector and the particular country, and how quickly or not quickly the enterprises have been able to adapt, and consumers have changed their mind and so on. But in general, we could say that the demand for face-to-face services, such as tourism or entertainment, will decline compared to the demand for remote services like business services. Yeah? The demand for services, on top of that, will decline compared to those for physical goods, because physical goods are a lot safer to provide. Yeah? If you are shipping a container full of I don't know, the flowers, or wheat grains or something, there's especially if they are shipped over a period of time, there's virtually no risk of infection through that process. Whereas if you are going on a foreign holiday, you are running a risk. Yeah? Of physical goods, the demand for manufactured goods will rise in relative terms, because manufactured goods can replace, substitute for some of the experiences that we get through face-to-face services. Yeah? So I don't know, I mean, I'm just giving a random example, but I might have been saving money to go and see Angkor Wat, yeah? And then I realized that there's a little prospect of this trip happening in the next few years. I might as well buy a better TV so that I can at least watch the place, yeah, in that more vivid terms, yeah. I mean, virtual reality experiences will be expanded, and there are a lot of information technology companies working towards that. Yeah. So manufactured goods at least certain types can substitute for the lost services, whereas I mean, I don't know, food and agricultural products and so on, I mean, they cannot. Yeah. So this means that countries with a stronger manufacturing base, such as Switzerland, Singapore, Germany, Korea, they will do better in relative terms than more service-based economies like the US and the UK. Yeah? Actually, some of you might be scratching your head because I said Switzerland and Singapore, which most people think are service-based economies, but these two economies are literally the most industrialized economies in the world. Yeah? In terms of per capita manufacturing value added, Switzerland is #1 in the world. Singapore is #2 in the world. It's not Germany, it's not South Korea, although they are pretty high up there. Yeah? Always check your facts. The next more predictable change is the change in the global supply chains. When the crisis first happened, a lot of people say, oh, this means that global supply chains will have to be completely reorganized. We've seen the fragility of this system, that in the last 2-3 decades. Okay, I mean, the global value chains are not actually modern inventions. There were global value chains way back from the 1950s and 60s. The Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, they were, doing the assembly work, making for American electronics companies, making stuffed toys and shoes for American department stores and companies like Nike in those days. So this is nothing new, but it is true that in the last 2-3 decades, these global value chains have become very widespread and become very complicated and very efficient. but that efficiency was predicated on there being no disruption. Yeah? Now, when you had this kind of disruption, when China shut down, for example, in the very early days of pandemic, car factories, say Volkswagen factory in Germany, couldn't be run because they needed to import parts from China. So people started talking about complete reorganization of global value chains. Some of them have talked about the so-called reshoring of production. So that you had offshore your production to countries like China and Vietnam and the Philippines, and then now you really need to bring this back because you're not so sure about there being smoothly run the global value chain. But in my view, I think this the major restructuring of global value chains is highly unlikely. First of all, it is very expensive to do it. There is a reason why you have built these chains. I mean, you have identified the most efficient production site. You built the whole logistic system around it, and you have it working like clockwork, and then you cannot suddenly change it. You can, but it will be very expensive. So I don't think there'll be any large-scale reorganization of global value chain. But more importantly, I think many countries cannot reshore their production on any large scale because they have offshored so much that they have already destroyed their own industrial ecosystem. I mean, I'm talking about the countries like the US and the UK. Even if Apple wants to bring the production of iPhone back to California, it cannot do it. It doesn't have the suppliers, it doesn't have the necessary workers, it doesn't have the logistic systems. Okay, I mean, it can do it if it's willing to spend billions and billions of dollars over a long period, but it's not something that you can do that easily because it means that building the whole so-called industrial ecosystem, you need the skilled workers, you need the supplier companies, you need a logistic system, you need supporting research labs. You don't have them. Anyway, having said this, I think there'll be some reorganization of global supply chains because people now realize that, well, we probably should diversify our supply sources. So a lot of companies are talking about China plus one. So we have only one factory essentially in China supplying virtually all of our input. Virtually all of our the particular input. So in order to diversify risk, we should set up another factory, say in Vietnam, so that if something happens in one of these two countries, you at least have some supply. People are already talking about increasing inventory because we have been running this so-called just-in-time production system where you don't have inventory, things are delivered on time, so that you don't have to have warehouses, you don't have inventory costs, but people are saying maybe we've overdone it, maybe we should have more inventory to create a buffer against that risk. Maybe that we will train workers in multiple skills because if some people get sick, if they cannot be easily replaced, that we need we are in trouble, so we need that people who can do more than one job. So these kind of changes will happen, but even at that level, it's not as easy as it sounds. Maybe you can do for some things at the lower level of technology, some things that can be produced sourced from more than one or two places. But when it comes to high-end products, you rely on one or two suppliers exactly because there aren't that many suppliers who can actually do it. Yeah? And so about 10 years ago, there was this famous earthquake in Japan, the so-called Fukushima Earthquake. And during the earthquake, the particular, I forget exactly what it was producing, but a particular very specialized chemical factory was destroyed. And it turned out that it was supplying something like 70% of this particular chemical that was critical in the production of semiconductors. So the entire world semiconductor industry had to be frozen for a while because you suddenly lost 70% of your supply. So if you want to avoid that kind of situation, you would ideally have more than one or two suppliers, but there was only one company exactly because not many companies have the necessary technologies. So to sum up, I believe that there will be some reorganization of global value chains, but not as much as what some people have said, and especially there'll be very little so-called reshoring. Some countries can do it. Countries that already have a strong manufacturing base, like Germany and Korea, they can do it. But the US, the UK, forget it because they have already destroyed their own industrial ecosystem. Now, having seen the more likely changes, let's move on to the difficult to predict, although quite likely changes. And the first of this is the expansion and the reorganization of the role of the state. In the last few decades, even after the 2008 financial crisis, that has revealed a lot of weaknesses of the free market thinking, sometimes known as neoliberalism. Basically, the orthodoxy was that a smaller and an institutionally more constrained government is a better government. So that you want the government to do as little as possible, but even when it's doing something, it should be, allowed very little discretion. Some of you would have learned this debate on rules versus discretion in macroeconomics. So that yes, the government should run a budgetary system, but it should be put under institutional restrictions on what it can do. So that it has to balance budget. A lot of countries have the laws requiring balanced budget. Some other countries have ceilings on the public debt. The US that has it. Germany has it, although it has suspended it during the pandemic crisis. But during this crisis, all of this orthodoxy went out of the window, because they realized that without huge government intervention, the whole economy collapsed. So a lot of countries are running huge budget deficits. As I just said, the German government, famous for its fiscal conservatism, abolished the ceiling on public debt. The UK and many other governments are paying firms to keep workers on the payroll, the famous furlough scheme. Essentially, the government acting as the employer of last resort. Many companies have been kept from bankruptcy through government subsidies. So the orthodox playbook has been thrown out, and now there's the serious consideration of what the government should be doing. Now, I think in general, there's likely to be an expansion in the role of the state or the government. And I think it's also likely that there'll be a shift away from more unfocused macroeconomic policies towards more targeted industrial and technology policies. Within macroeconomic policies, move away from monetary to fiscal policies, which are more targeted than the former. And within the realm of fiscal policy, the taboo about fiscal deficit and public debt will be weakened, although not won't disappear. So I can predict some of this general shift, but exactly how is going to be reshaped, that really depends on the country. You know, who would have thought that Germany would go as far as abolishing ceiling on public debt because it's famous for fiscal conservatism. Yeah, who would have thought that they would extend their own furlough scheme? But I mean, it has already declared that it will extend it for another 2 years if necessary. Yeah? But there will be a lot of shift, and yeah, having seen that you under at least some circumstances you absolutely need a government. I think a lot of taboo about government intervention that will disappear. Secondly, there'll be a lot of welfare and labor reform. I mean, this is one area that has kind of shock people into rethinking about, because this pandemic has shown that no one is safe unless everyone is safe. You know? It has shown that public health cannot be maintained in the face of a pandemic unless everyone has some degree of security in income and possibly employment, not to speak about access to healthcare. You know, the contrast between the US and Europe in this regard is quite remarkable. In the US, because a lot of people didn't have sick pay, you know, the US companies are not obliged to give paid sick leaves. You know? Yeah, actually, the US companies are not obliged to give any leave. I mean, there's no mandatory paid holiday, although it is conventional that decent companies will give 2 to 3 weeks of paid holiday, but it's not legally required. Yeah? Anyway, so in the US, a lot of the people, despite being sick, had to work because they couldn't get the sick leave, and this contributed to spreading the disease in countries. It wasn't just that in the US, but in many countries, all this kind of people with precarious employment, like delivery workers and so on, they had to work because if they didn't work, they don't eat. You know? So in a lot of countries that poor people kept working even while they are sick. You know? In countries with even in the countries with a decent welfare state, the crisis revealed the crucial gaps, especially in the protection of the self-employed people, you know? As well as the casualized workers. You know? So a lot of countries are now thinking about strengthening their welfare state and labor rights. Yeah? So better income support, stronger unemployment insurance not tied to particular jobs, because in many countries, the unemployment insurance comes with your job. So if you had been unemployed, if you had been in the casual contract and so on, it's virtually impossible to get unemployment insurance. So a lot of countries are talking about actually generalizing unemployment insurance. And people are talking about the need for sick leave. Yeah. So I think that once again, the shape of the changes are still uncertain and will certainly differ across countries, but a lot of countries will see changes in the welfare state and the labor reform in a direction of strengthening these things. Next, the pandemic is likely to lead to a re-evaluation of social priorities. You know, one very interesting phenomenon during this pandemic was that a lot of countries introduced this category of essential employees, essential services, you know. Yeah, in the UK, they were called key workers. In the US, they were called essential employees, you know, people without whom the society that cannot even maintain its basic function. Yeah? So health workers, care home workers, people working in food production and food processing, education, grocery stores, delivery services. Yeah? These people all got suddenly called key workers, you know, essential employees, sometimes even heroes, you know, and have been praised for their importance. You know? Now, this is actually quite unthinkable in the standard market economics, yeah, because the main point of market economics is that there's no priority between activities that is independent of what the market decides. Yeah? So if someone's getting paid a lot of money, it must mean that that person is very important for society. Yeah? So the market economists have emphasized that, well, that if you try to decide who's more valuable through the kind of political dictation, like under the central planning system, it leads to a disaster. It's ethically unacceptable. Yeah? Who are you, the central the planning committee or some dictator saying that, well, the supermarket workers are more important than I don't know, the people working in car factories. Yeah? But in this pandemic, a lot of societies have recognized that there is actually such thing as basic needs. Yeah? There is such thing as essential services, essential goods. And yeah, I think that in the long run, this will be a huge challenge for market economies because we have that actually, without realizing it, undermine one of the central tenets of pro-market economics. Yeah? Because in it, the ultimate arbiter of the value of something is the market. Yeah? And according to that criterion, all these the key workers were not very important people because they were paid very little. Yeah? Or zero if you are a person, usually a woman, doing household work and care work at home without being paid for it. Yeah? So collectively, the feminist economists have called these people, these activities, the reproductive economy or the care economy. Yeah? So household work, child care work, yeah? Health, education, in the basically these are things that society needs to reproduce itself. Yeah? In market economics, these people working in the care economy, except for the medical doctors, are all unimportant because they are lowly paid. So with this change in perspective, many people are arguing that we need to recognize the value and provide better compensation for the work conducted in the reproductive or the care economy. And indeed, there are many things that to do about this. In the early days of the pandemic in the UK, I mean, we had this custom of the people coming out of their house and clapping for NHS workers once a week, and a lot of NHS workers that were saying, well, we cannot pay for our bills with hand claps. Give us the better wages. Give us the better working condition. So we need to take real actions. There are lots of things that you could potentially do. You can raise minimum wages for workers in the reproductive economy. Care home assistant, the nurses, delivery workers. We can also improve their working conditions or job security through better labor market regulation. For household work, we can think about providing longer and better paid parental leave, higher subsidies for childcare, explicit payment for household work through the welfare state, and stronger labor market regulation that help women not to be discriminated on the ground of a career break due to childbirth and childcare. This is one very common injustice. A lot of the men, especially older men, complain that women are not giving birth to enough children, and then when they treat women who work for them, they say, well, you cannot get a promotion because you took a five-year career break to have children. So that kind of thing needs to change. So once again, I'm just listing possible changes. I'm not saying that any of these are more likely or that more important. It will all depend on what different societies want, what different people do to acquire some of these, make some of these changes. And finally, I think this pandemic is likely to bring about changes in the global economic and political order. One very interesting thing about this crisis is that many rich countries have shown high degree of disorganization and incompetence in dealing with the pandemic, while many developing countries, even including some of the poorest ones like Vietnam, Ethiopia, and Rwanda, have managed the pandemic very well. And I think this has made a lot of developing countries lose their inferiority complex that they used to have vis-a-vis their former colonial masters and other rich countries. I still remember when I was a kid that people looked up to the United States. That I am from South Korea. And in those days, people looked up to the US so much that they thought it was utopia, and the joke would be that when you go to the United States, even children can speak English, and even beggars smoke American cigarettes. Because for the Koreans in those days, being able to speak English and being able to smoke American cigarettes was the highest kind of degree of achievement. Yeah, so a lot of the people in developing countries have this inferiority complex vis-a-vis Britain, US, France, but now they have been seen to be emperors without clothes. Yeah, and particularly interesting is that some of the smaller developed countries, with less the arrogance and pretension, have managed the pandemic much better. New Zealand, Norway, Finland, and so on. So it's not necessarily East-West divide or the rich-poor divide, but the more powerful developing countries, developed countries, have been exposed for their incompetence and disorganization. And I think that in the very long run, this will have a huge impact indirectly, psychologically, and so, but this will be a huge impact. And also at the more practical level, partly as a result of these differences in pandemic management, the developing countries are going to suffer much less from the current crisis in the coming years, accelerating the trend of relative increase in the economic power, in their economic power that have happened in the last few decades. So in the mid-1970s, nearly 80% of world output was produced by the rich countries. By 2018, which is the latest that we have, it was less than 66%. And this trend will accelerate. And yeah, both of these, the psychological impact and real impact will make developing countries more assertive in demanding the reform of the international economic order. Okay, all the 4 changes that I have discussed in the second part of my talk are less certain to happen than the 4 changes that I discussed in the first part, because these changes require, first of all, substantial changes in individual and social value systems, and secondly, significant changes in policies and institutions, and thirdly, strong political conflicts and big compromises, because that compared to, I don't know, reorganizing global supply chain, expanding the welfare state, or changing the way that the government manages that macroeconomic policy, involve far more significant changes in people's values, that institutions, and the political positions. So in that sense, it's up to us that as the individuals, groups, nations, and the humanity, whether we can learn the right lessons from the current crisis and introduce these changes that will make our economy and society better. And I think that's the only way that we can show appreciation about literally millions of people who have been sacrificed to this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. So we'll have a Q&A session now. In light of the time, I think we'll take about 3 to 4 questions, maybe. So first, in line with you were talking about just now, so in light of the second wave and subsequent waves of COVID in the industrialized West, although you have clarified that the West is also different in its impacts, will this pandemic turn China into the core of the global economic and financial system? And will they be working together with the other developing countries maybe to do this?
Yes, yeah, no, I mean, definitely this will increase the importance of China, but, I'm not a kind of scholar in terms of politics, so I'm a bit of a kind of amateur here. But, I think that there are 2 things to consider. First of all, China becoming more important, does it necessarily mean that it will become the new hegemon? I think that's very unlikely, partly because China doesn't want it, at least yet. Because if you become the hegemon, you have a lot of responsibilities. I mean, of course, you have a lot of benefits by being the top dog, but it's still a huge project. So this is why the US was reluctant to take over from the UK before the Second World War, despite the economy having already had become the most important in the late 19th, early 20th century, because it didn't want the responsibility. So that's one thing to consider. But the other is that even if China wanted it, the US hegemony will be not that easy to demolish, partly because the global hegemony is something that has been created through actual history. So for example, the fact that we are speaking in English, yeah, I mean, it's that basically carry over from British dominance and then American dominance, yeah. So this means that English speakers have a huge advantage in terms of controlling global media, have a lot more soft power than what is suggested by their mere income. Yeah. On top of that, the U.S. has a dollar hegemony. Even the euro hasn't been able to push the U.S. dollar from the position of world currency, and when you control the world currency, it gives you a lot of leeway. So yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that it will never happen, but that it's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, meaning, I mean, in my view, not in the next generation. Yeah, maybe after that. But yeah, it's clear that China will become far more important after this pandemic than before. It was already a clear trend, but it will accelerate. And I don't know. I mean, it partly depends on how other countries are going to coalesce or not around China's attempt to reorganize a global economic order, even if it doesn't want to become the hegemon. It still will want to reorganize the global economic and political order. And I mean, China, because of its past participation in the so-called non-aligned movement and so on, it has some goodwill from the developing countries, but it's also true that a lot of developing countries are realizing that China is not necessarily so different from other rich countries when it comes to flexing its economic muscles. So yeah, I mean, a lot will depend on how this international politics plays out.
That's fair enough. Another like highly upvoted question is that countries that are less globalized are actually suffering less from the pandemic since less people are moving into them. So does this change the traditional way we look at globalization?
Well, I mean, like everything else, globalization comes with benefits and costs. Yeah. So if you are in a situation like this, yes, I mean that less globalized countries have suffered less because there are fewer the incidences of the germs are coming your way. But that's one benefit of not being globalized. But there are costs of not being globalized. I mean, you don't have access to the global knowledge stock. You don't have as many market opportunities and so on. So yeah, you have to weigh different things, and yeah, different countries will make different choices. I mean, there's nothing inherently good or bad about globalization. So some countries might say we want to become even more open as a result of this because we realize unless we earn a lot of foreign exchanges and are able to buy the vaccines and healthcare equipment, and so we cannot even keep our people safe. Others might say, yes, this is a sign that we should restrain our openness. But I don't think there's anything inherently good or bad about globalization. It just is a kind of matter of choice. What do you want? What is your society's goal? What different values that you put on different things. I mean, this is not about globalization, but different countries have different preferences. Americans like to work longer so that they can have more money. Asians are similar, but Europeans say, well, what's the point of having money if you don't have time to spend the money? So the Europeans work much less than the Americans. The Germany, Netherlands, France. I mean, they work between 25 and 40% less than the Americans. Yeah? But they have a high productivity. Actually, in terms of output per hour's work, not output per capita, France is above the US. Yeah? I mean, people think that French are just relaxed, yeah. People who want to, who don't want to work and enjoy life, but actually, yeah, I mean, they work much less, but while they work, they're incredibly productive. But can you say one is necessarily better than the other? Yeah? I mean, it's partly a matter of choice, yeah? Partly a matter of values. Yeah? Although there are some elements of unnecessary overwork in the American culture. Yeah? I mean, you cannot say that this is necessarily good or bad. So yeah, likewise, globalization. Yeah, I mean, this has exposed certain types of dangers of globalization. Yeah? I mean, your whole country might get sucked into the global pandemic. Yeah? You might experience serious disruption in the production because you cannot import things. Yeah, but there are other benefits. Yeah? So I think that different societies will make their own judgments. Yeah?
I think that's true. So maybe one last question on debt and Europe, which is that how do you think the EU member states' focus on controlling debt to GDP ratios will affect the recovery? Are fears of rising debt justified or overblown?
Thank you. Well, debt to GDP, I mean, in a way, it's kind of in itself doesn't really mean very much. Yeah? Debt to GDP ratio in Britain for a couple of decades after the Second World War were like 150%. I think at its height it was something like 270. Yeah? But I mean, also today debt to GDP ratio of Japan is something like 240%. Yeah? So there's no kind of clear cutoff line above which that shouldn't rise because essentially what's important is that how in the dynamic sense the economy is able to manage the debt. Yeah. So if you have the weak economy, yeah, which is not growing very fast, even relatively low debt to GDP ratio could be a huge burden. If you're a dynamic economy which is able to service the debt, exports a lot, then it may not be such a problem. Yeah? So that's one thing. And but secondly, it's misleading to focus only on public debt. Yeah, I mean, if you're worried about debt, you should be worried about all debts. Yeah, no, because suppose that if the European government didn't, I don't know, that run deficit and therefore contract debt during this pandemic, individuals will have had to borrow money. Yeah? Companies will have had to borrow money. Yeah? Debt will have had to go up. Yeah? So actually, the question is that not the overall level of debt. Yeah? It's that more about, yeah? I mean, who's the contracting debt. Yeah? So that you have to look at public and private debt together. But then, in a crisis situation like this, it's far more efficient for the government to run debt than companies or individuals, because government has the kind of credit position that no one can match. Yeah? I mean, in normal situation, you can have and should have a debate on whether it's more efficient for the government to run that than private companies in an economic downturn. Yeah? But in a crisis situation like this, I don't think there's any question about who, given that you have to run a huge amount of debt, there's no question about who's got to run the debt, yeah? Because the kind of scale of debt that is required, the state of the economy, all of this basically means that it has to be the government. Yeah? I mean, if you try to ride out this crisis by letting individuals and companies run debt, there'll be huge amount of bankruptcy, yeah? With all the social disruptions and the loss of productive knowledge that I talked about earlier. You know, it's insane idea. Yeah? So, you know, that in a situation like this, that you have to have the public sector run that rather than the private sector or the households. But I mean, even in a situation which is not as this extreme, I mean, you have to always think about different types of debts together. Yeah? If public debt is a problem, private debts, well, as we have seen in the 2008 financial crisis, can also be a problem. Yeah? So the important thing is that what kind of debt in what context, and in the what quantity is the most the kind of viable in the long run and beneficial for society. Yeah? Because you know, some people take this extreme position, believing that debt is somehow a sin. Yeah. I mean, that is wrong by definition. No, that's insane. Yeah, that way, many of you are studying with the student loan. Yeah, you shouldn't be doing that. Yeah, I mean, most companies should be shut down because they are running on debt. Yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with debt itself. Yeah? Actually, it can be a good thing if you use it to increase your future productivity. Yeah? Government can also use that to increase future productivity if it invested in infrastructure, education, healthcare, research and development. So that itself is not a bad thing or a good thing. Yeah? It can be good, it can be bad, depending on who contracts it when, how much, and uses it for what. Yeah? So this debate about that should be much more broadened than what you normally see in the financial press. Yeah?
That's a very insightful perspective, and the need to consider the nuances of the context. And I think we've reached the time for today. So thank you so much, Dr. Chang, and all of you for joining us here today. Just a quick reminder, next Tuesday, we'll be having a moderated discussion here with Ben Bernanke, previous chairman of the Federal Reserve. So once again, thank you, Dr. Chang, and all of you for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.